Right, EU5 is on the horizon, the map painters are limbering up, and I've brought a list guaranteed to make someone furious in the comments. Today we're ranking every Paradox Grand Strategy game, from worst to best, based on two things that actually matter: how they launched and what they became after years of patches, many DLC, and frankly heroic modders. Are Paradox the kings of Grand Strategy? Look, when you've got Europa Universalis, Hearts of Iron, Crusader Kings, Victoria, Stellaris, plus the odd misadventure into Rome and Napoleonic side quests, you're probably wearing the crown jewels at the Grand Strategy ball. Nobody does living, sprawling historical sandboxes quite like them, even if they occasionally trip up over their own systems. So here's how Luke and I have classified it. We're looking at in-house Paradox Grand Strategy. We'll also take a nod at a couple of Paradox published curios for context, but it's not going to be every game they've ever touched, and it's not a DLC tier list. We're going to judge day one state, bugs, balance, ambition, against the final form, or the current form, patches, expansions, and the all-important mod scene. Some games launched wonky and became brilliant, some just stayed wonky. So if you love a spicy debate, you're in the right video. Drop your personal top 5 as you watch below, like if you like these sort of deep dives, and subscribe for more coverage of these sort of things. Alright, brew in hand, maps at the ready, let's start at the bottom and climb up. Okay, we're kicking things off with a bit of a footnote in Paradox history, March of the Eagles. Released in 2013, this Napoleonic War experiment was essentially Europa Universalis Light, stripped down to just cover the 1805 to 1815 period. At launch it wasn't a disaster by any means, stable, fairly polished, and it did exactly what it said on the tin. Let you take command of France, Britain, Austria, or one of their mates, and bash each other across Europe. But compared to Paradox's bigger titles, it felt paper thin. Critics called it solid but unremarkable, and most fans saw it as a stopgap before EU4 landed later that year. Fast forward to today and not much has changed. There's been no DLC, no expansions, no sweeping mod scene. Paradox patched it a couple of times and then quietly walked away, leaving it frozen in time on the old EU3 engine. Legacy wise, March of the Eagles is remembered more as a curiosity than a classic. It's the B-side for Paradox. Competent, even fun for a quick spin, but lacking the ambition or depth to stand alongside the greats. Next up, Sengoku. Paradox's awkward teenage phase where they thought, what if Crusader Kings, but only in Japan? Released in 2011, this was essentially a prototype for what CK2 would become just a year later. On release, it wasn't buggy or broken, it was just bare bones. You had clans vying for dominance in feudal Japan, a bit of intrigue, a few ninja assassinations for flavour, but nowhere near the scope or depth Paradox fans were used to. Reviews at the time polite described this as niche, which is code for only buy this if you're really into Japanese history and have a high tolerance for unfinished ideas. Today, Sengoku hasn't aged that gracefully. It got a couple of patches and then was left to gather dust as all Paradox's energy went into Crusader Kings II. No expansions, no big modding scene, no thriving multiplayer community. It was just abandoned faster than a Dishonored Samurai. You can still pick it up on Steam and a handful of dedicated fans will tell you it's got some charm, but compare it to CK2 or 3 and it feels like a tech demo. Legacy wise, Sengoku is more of a historical curiosity than a pillar of the genre. It proved the character driven formula could work outside Europe, but it lacked the content or support to hold anyone's attention. Now here is a strange one, Europa Universalis Rome. In 2008, Paradox decided to take their tried and tested EU3 engine and march it back to antiquity. On paper it sounded glorious, legions, senators, barbarian invasions, all wrapped up in the grand strategy form. But the reality was at launch the game was, well, bare. It played like a stripped down EU3 with a toga on, you had characters but they lacked the personality of Crusader Kings, you had provinces but far fewer mechanics driving them. Even Paradox admitted it needed work. which is why the Ve Victus expansion arrived later the same year, bolting on things like loyalties and events which made it more interesting. Fast forward to 2025 and this game feels properly ancient and not in a good way. It hasn't been touched in over a decade, the UI is clunky and the map tiny compared to modern standards, and most fans have long migrated onto things like Imperator Rome. Legacy wise, this one sits in a very weird spot. Some fans argue it's very ahead of its time, a prototype for ideas Paradox would later revisit. Others just see it as a dud, a toga party where half the guests never bloody turned up. Either way, EU Rome was one of those titles that make you say, oh right, that one existed, before promptly booting up any other title. Back in 2004, Paradox tried something completely different. Instead of running a country, what if you ran a family? Thus, Crusader Kings was born, the first grand strategy to swap spreadsheets for scandal and maps for marriage alliances. At launch, CK1 was ambitious but messy. It was clunky, half-finished and limited. You could only play Christian rulers, and the characters, while novel, were more cardboard cutouts than scheming dynasts that we'd come to love later. The UI looked dated even back then, and whole features felt bolted on with duct tape. Reviews at the time called it a fascinating concept, but hard to recommend unless you were already knee-deep in Paradox fandom. Fast forward to today and CK1 feels like reading the rough draft of a great novel. Expansion Deus Vult in 2007 really polished things up with better AI and more character events, but it never reached the heights of the sequels that came afterward. Legacy wise, Crusader Kings deserves respect. It introduced the dynasty system and stress tested the idea of characters as the core of grand strategy, and set the stage for one of Paradox's most beloved series. But compared to what came after, it's a clunky relic. But I like to think that CK1 walked so that others could run and eventually sprint and seduce half of medieval Europe along the way. Now, if Crusader Kings was Paradox experimenting with characters, Victoria and Empire Under the Sun was them experimenting with bloody spreadsheets. It was released in 2003, and Vic 1 was one of the most ambitious simulations of the 19th century ever attempted. Politics, industrialization, demographics, revolutions, colonization, all crammed into one game. The problem was that it was so confusing, no one had the slightest clue what was bloody happening. Paradox themselves once joked it had the interface that God forgot. At launch, players were baffled. Pops would rebel, economy would tank without warning, and the game had more moving parts than a Victorian steam engine. Reviews were mixed, impressed by the ambition, exhausted by the execution. Things did improve with 2006 and the Revolution's expansion, which extended the timelines and made the economy and politics a bit more manageable. Modders stepped in a big way. The Victoria Improvement Project was legendary for smoothing out rough edges and adding flavour. Still, by today's standards, Vic 1 is a slog. Legacy wise though, you can't underestimate it. This was Paradox daring to model society itself, classes, ideologies, industrial growth, and the messy reality of governing in the modern age. It was too much though, too soon, and only a small niche stuck with it. But without Vic 1, we wouldn't have had beloved sequels that still hold cult status today. Before Hearts of Iron 4 became a Twitch darling, Paradox cut their teeth on the original Hearts of Iron back in 2002. It was the first time anyone had tried to simulate the entire Second World War in real time on a grand strategy map, and the ambition was staggering. Every country, every theatre, every front, all under your command. At launch though, it was a mess. Bugs, balance issues, and an AI that had no clue how to handle the global war, and it meant you often see these bizarre outcomes, like Luxembourg conquering half of Europe, while the Allies just sat back and relaxed. Interface was dense, mechanics undercooked, and the critics were torn between applauding the vision and wincing at the execution. It was patched, and eventually a premium edition that bundled fixes and tweaks was launched, but most of the community had moved on by that time. Legacy wise, I gotta say, Hearts of Iron deserves a salute. It set the template, the tech trees, the production lines, and the idea of fighting World War II on all fronts simultaneously. It was flawed, sure, but it was also groundbreaking. In the grand scheme, it's a fascinating prototype, but one that has long been superseded. Ah yes, Imperator Rome, the grand return to antiquity that somehow managed to trip over its own sandals. Released in 2019, expectations were sky high. It was meant to be the successor to Europa Universalis Rome, blending the best bits of EU, CK and Vic all into one glorious ancient sandbox. The core systems leaned heavily on mana points for everything, and it made it feel more like a board game than a living empire. Characters lacked personality, warfare felt flat, and many fans accused it of being shallow, a pretty damning word in Paradox circles. Steam reviews went to mostly negative, and I think it's the only Paradox grand strategy game to ever wear that shame, and Johan Andersson, the studio veteran leading the project, even admitted they misread what players wanted. But to their credit, Paradox did not abandon this one immediately. Massive updates like the 1.5 Meander or the 2.0 Marius update overhauled entire systems, gave deeper population mechanics, revamped armies, and gave proper mission trees. By 2021, it had genuinely become a much better game, and people started to warm to it, and then Paradox pulled the plug, shelving further development. There was a maintenance patch in 2024, but no new content on the horizon. So today, Imperator sits in a strange limbo. The Invictus mod has kept the community alive, adding a lot of flavour and missions, and Steam reviews have turned mostly positive after years of the love bombing, but it's still a tragic what could have been. Legacy wise, it's Paradox's most famous flop, a game with great potential, kneecapped by a poor start, and abandoned just as it was getting good. Hearts of Iron III was Paradox saying, alright then, let's make the most detailed World War II simulator imaginable. This was released in 2009 and it boasted thousands of provinces, a detailed order of battle hierarchy, logistics on a scale that could give NATO planners a migraine, and it promptly collapsed under the weight of its own ambition. At launch, the game was a car crash. The AI couldn't handle invasions, supply lines were broken, and the interface was just about as welcoming as a minefield. Even die-hard fans admitted it was borderline unplayable in the 1.0. Reviews range from cautiously impressed by the vision to utterly exasperated. But the thing is, over time, expansions like Semper Fi for the Motherland and their Finest Hour patched and polished it into something much more respectable. And by the end, Hearts of Iron III became a grognard's delight. Complex, detailed and rewarding you if you had the patience and a lot of cups of tea to wrestle with it. Mods like Black Ice doubled down on the detail, turning it into a definitive World War II sandbox for the most hardcore. In 2025, Hearts of Iron III is firmly in a niche. Its depth is admired, but the clunkiness keeps most players firmly in the Hearts of Iron IV camp. For those few veterans though, it is the true World War II simulator. For everyone else, it's a reminder of Paradox's old habit of launching first and fixing later. Quick pause before we dive any deeper. If you're enjoying this slow descent into Paradox-induced madness, do me a favour, hit the like button, subscribe and maybe even hit the bell for notifications. Consider it your very own national decision. Plus 10 prestige, plus 5 legitimacy and a permanent buff to future video recommendations. Now we arrive at the one that started it all, at least for me, Europa Universalis, released in 2000, when half of us were still arguing over whether Windows ME was a good idea. Based on a French board game, this was Paradox's first proper swing at computer grand strategy, and honestly, it was a revelation. At launch, critics praised its depth. You could guide any nation from 1492 through to the Napoleonic era, juggling diplomacy, warfare, colonization and religion all in one enormous sandbox, and it was quite unlike anything else at the time. The flip side is the UI was punishing, tutorials were bare bones, and the AI occasionally behaved like it'd been dropped on its head. Reviews were positive, but of course they noted that only true strategy obsessives would survive the learning curve. Fast forward to 2025 and EU1 is practically a museum piece. The map looks crude, mechanics are simplistic compared with what came later, and good luck getting to run it smoothly on a modern PC without a bit of tinkering. There was a small modding scene back in the day, but mostly historical scenario tweaks. Once EU2 dropped in 2001, everyone had jumped ship. Legacy wise though, Europa Universalis is monumental. It planted the seed for everything that followed. Real time with pulls, grand campaigns, alternate histories, and the sheer joy of taking a minor nation and willing it into an empire. In short, EU1 was the rough but essential prototype, the granddaddy of grand strategy. If the first Victoria was a beautiful mess of charts and revolts, Victoria 2 was the sequel that finally made sense of it all. Released back in 2010, it took the ambitious simulation of the 19th century and gave it the polish and balance that the original sorely lacked. At launch, VIC-2 wasn't perfect. The base game had some quirks, late game slowdown, an AI that sometimes colonised Africa like it just downed 6 espressos, and the occasional revolt storm that made you question your life choices. But compared to its predecessor, it was a revelation. The expansions though are what cemented its reputation. House Divided added nuance to the early game, while Heart of Darkness revamped colonisation with great power diplomacy, and with those VIC-2 became a cult classic. A game where the real victory wasn't conquest but getting your literacy rate above 80% without your population revolting every Tuesday. Fast forward to today and VIC-2 still has a fiercely loyal fanbase. Mods like Historical Project Mod have kept it alive long after official support ended, and many argue that VIC-2's pop system remains Paradox's most detailed and satisfying simulation, and many will tell you VIC-3 hasn't surpassed it yet. Legacy wise, VIC-2 is iconic. It turned a niche experiment into a series that people still talk about in reverent tones, and it proved running a country could be about railways and reforms just as much as it is about wars and empires. When Crusader Kings III launched in 2020, it felt almost suspiciously polished for a Paradox game. Slick new interface, full 3D characters, proper tutorials. This was a grand strategy game you could actually recommend to your mates without needing to send them a 40-page PDF beforehand. Critics loved it, 9s and 10s across the board, sold over 1 million copies within a month, and CK3 managed to capture the spirit of its predecessor while making it more approachable. You could still seduce your brother's wife and assassinate the Pope, watch your inbred dynasty collapse in flames, but now it all came with lovely tooltips that actually explain what on earth was going on. But, and it is a big but, CK3 at launch didn't have anywhere near the breadth of CK2 with all its DLC. A lot of the weirder, wilder mechanics, secret cults, supernatural events, full-blown merchant republics, they weren't there yet. And in 2025 I still think that holds true. Expansions like Royal Court and Tours and Tournaments have added depth, and free updates have fleshed out culture, travel and intrigue, but CK2 remains the king of sheer content bloat. Modding though has helped enormously. We have Elder Kings 2 back, we have the AGOT mod back, and thousands of smaller mods are keeping the community buzzing. For now though, CK3 for me sits below its predecessor. It's slick, it's modern, it's the best entry point Paradox has ever made, but it hasn't matched the mad sprawling chaos that made CK2 legendary. Few Paradox games have carried as much hype as Victoria 3. Fans waited over a decade for it, whispering memes like Vic3 confirmed every time Paradox so much as sneezed. When it finally launched in 2022, expectations were sky high, and wow was the reaction mixed. Critics were fairly positive, praising ambitious economic simulation and societal depth, but long-time Vic2 veterans weren't convinced, wars felt too hands-off, diplomacy too shallow, and the UI spammed you consistently. Steam reviews settled at a very nervous mixed, and plenty of old guard players loudly declared they were sticking with Vic2 until further notice. The twist is that Paradox stuck with it unlike they had with other titles, and over the past 3 years, patches and DLCs have steadily transformed the game. Updates like the 1.9 Charters of Commerce reworked trade, performance got smoother, and politics and diplomacy gained proper teeth. By 2025, reviews have flipped to mostly positive, and players are coming around to the idea that Vic3 really does capture the spirit of the 19th century. The modding community has also helped fill the gaps, alternate histories, expanded events, full-on overhauls, and is building the same kind of support that Vic2 thrived on. Now I get this one is probably my most controversial inclusion at this higher place, but I think it's shaping up to be a slow burn success story. A rocky launch, but unlike Imperator Rome, this one is alive and growing. If Vic2 was the cult classic, Vic3 is the ambitious reboot that is still earning its stripes, and in a few years' time might even climb higher up this list. Released in 2007, Europa Universalis III was Paradox's bold step into the modern era. Gone were the 2D sprites of old. This was the first EU built on the Clausewitz engine, which had a shiny 3D map and a more open-ended approach to history. At launch though, it still felt a bit bare bones. The sandbox freedom was fantastic. You could take anyone from 1453 to 1820 and see what chaos you could unleash. But a lot of historical flavour from EU2 was stripped away. Critics liked the ambition but noted the world felt a bit empty. Still, it was very stable compared to its predecessors, and the new engine meant Paradox had room to grow, and grow it did. Expansions like Heir to the Throne and Divine Wind transformed EU3 into something brilliant. National decisions, Cassius Belli's, rebels with actual causes. And by its final form, EU3 was a rich, complex masterpiece. There were the mods as well, like Magna Mundi, pushing it even further. Legacy-wise, EU3 was the bridge between Paradox's scrappy early days and the polished juggernaut they'd become. It wasn't perfect, but it laid the groundwork for EU4's successes and proved grand strategy could be flexible and endlessly replayable. In short, EU3 was Paradox leveling up, and it deserves this high place in the list. If EU1 was a scrappy prototype, Europa Universalis II in 2001 was Paradox clearing its throat politely and saying, right, this is actually what we meant to do. It refined every corner of the formula. More nations, more events, more historical accuracy, and a map that felt positively luxurious compared to the first game. At launch, EU2 was a massive leap forward. Critics praised the sheer scope. You could play from 1419 to 1820 and guide everything from Ming China to the Knights of St. John and relive or rewrite world history as you saw fit. Sure, the UI was still dense and the AI occasionally had these brain farts, but compared to EU1 it was polished and confident, and it quickly became a cult hit, including with myself and Luke. Years later, EU2 got a second life in 2009 with For the Glory, a fan-based Paradox-blessed spin-off which polished the engine further, improved performance and added hundreds of historical events. Me and Luke adored this one. By 2025, EU2 has obviously dated. It still has loyal fans who will tell you it captures a certain charm that's been lost in the newer games, and the mod scene was immense, with scenario packs and total conversions, keeping it fresh right until EU3 took over. Legacy-wise, EU2 is a titan. It cemented Paradox as a studio worth watching, built the foundation for the EU franchise, and proved there was a real audience for long-form historical sandboxes. Crusader Kings II wasn't just a game, it was the moment Paradox truly broke out of the niche. Released in 2012, it took the scrappy ideas of CK1, dynasties, characters, intrigue, turned them into one of the most beloved strategy games Paradox has ever made. At launch, CK2 was already strong, interface was smooth, characters had more depth, and the stories practically were writing themselves. Murder your brother, marry your cousin, and accidentally end up with a horse as your chancellor, it was all possible. Critics praised it as both a deep grand strategy and a role-playing soap opera all mixed into one. But the real magic was in the growth. Over 7 years of expansion, from the Sword of Islam to the Old Gods to Holy Fury, the game ballooned into an absolutely enormous sandbox. By the end, you could play almost anyone, anywhere, from tribal pagans to Indian Rajas, across nearly 600 years of history. Yes, the DLC could buy you a decent weekend away, but the sheer scope was unmatched. Then there were the mods, Game of Thrones, Elder Kings, when the world stopped making sense. CK2 became a playground for history nerds and fantasy fans alike. And even now, long after CK3 launched, people still fire up CK2 for its crazy breadth and wild mods. Legacy-wise, CK2 is one of the crown jewels of Paradox. It didn't just sell millions, it brought in a whole new audience who realised grand strategy could be more than maps and armies. Now, Hearts of Iron 2 in 2005 was the real deal. It streamlined the chaos of Hearts of Iron 1, tightened the mechanics, and finally gave us a World War II grand strategy game that actually felt playable. Critics called it both deep and accessible, for which back then was high praise for Paradox. From day one, the game won fans. The combat model was sharper, the UI less painful, and expansions like Doomsday and Armageddon kept layering on the content. Suddenly you weren't just refighting World War II, you could take the Cold War into bizarre and what-if scenarios. And the game's modding scene really exploded. Then came the spin-offs, Arsenal of Democracy in 2010, leaning hard into economic realism, or Darkest Hour in 2011 refreshed the engine and added a full World War I campaign and just really polished the experience. Both were niche but very respected, and even today you can find diehards who swear by Darkest Hour as the true Hearts of Iron experience. In 2025 the game is obviously showing its age, but it still has classic charm. It's quick, focused and moddable as hell, and for many veterans it remains the gold standard. Less bloat than Hearts of Iron 3, more streamlined than Hearts of Iron 4, just right down the middle. Legacy wise, it proved that Paradox could take on World War II grand strategy and make it sing. And thanks to the modding scene, it's still fondly remembered as one of Paradox's finest hours. Now, when Hearts of Iron IV landed in 2016, it was immediately clear this was a different beast. After the overtly complex sprawl of Hearts of Iron III, Paradox went for accessibility without losing the grand sweep. And it worked. Hearts of Iron IV quickly became their fastest selling title at the time, pulling in hundreds of thousands of players who'd never touched a Paradox game before. At launch, it wasn't flawless. The AI sometimes struggled to mount naval invasions, and the peace conference system could sometimes spit out ridiculous borders, but it was stable, approachable, and fun. A bit of a rarity for 1.0 Paradox releases, to be honest. Critics praised it as being accessible, yet still one of the deepest World War II sims on the market. 9 years later, Hearts of Iron IV is colossal. Expansions like Man the Guns, No Step Back, and La Resistance have overhauled naval warfare, supply, espionage, and more. And the modding scene is legendary too. Kaiserreich thrives here, alongside Millennium Dawn, Old World Blues, and countless smaller mods out there. Multiplayer communities are huge, running competitive and roleplay games alike. Legacy wise, it's going to be a juggernaut for some time. With over 5 million copies sold and a consistently massive player count, Hearts of Iron IV made grand strategy mainstream. It might not be as brutally detailed as Hearts of Iron III, but it's fun, flexible, and endlessly replayable, and for many, it's the Paradox gateway drug. Luke wanted to put Stellaris at the top of this list, but it was my list, so we went with it in number 2. Now, this game came out swinging with exploration, alien encounters, and the promise of building your very own galactic empire. At launch, the early game was magical, sending science ships into the stars, discovering anomalies, and meeting your first weird mushroom people. But critics and players noted the mid-game got grindy fast, and late-game performance fell apart once the galaxy filled up with pops and fleet. Still, it sold like mad, over 200,000 copies in the first 24 hours, making it Paradox's fastest seller at the time. The real story of Stellaris though is how much it changed. Entire systems were rewritten. FTL travel replaced, planetary management rebuilt, from tiles into jobs, diplomacy and federations overhauled. Population growth was capped for performance, espionage added, and the galactic community brought in so you could argue over resolutions like some sort of space UN. It's practically a different game today and far richer for it. And then there is the modding. One of the greatest modding scenes ever known. Star Trek New Horizons, Star Wars Fallen Republic, Mass Effect Beyond the Relays, Warhammer 40k, you name the universe and someone has ported it into Stellaris. Combined with Paradox's DLC machine, Utopia, Federations, Nemesis, Overlord and more, and Stellaris has become less a game and more a galactic playground. Legacy wise, Stellaris is undoubtedly special. It proved Paradox could step away and outside of history and still dominate this grand strategy space. It's endlessly replayable, endlessly moddable and still growing. Whether you're uplifting space sloths into sentience or role-playing a genocidal toaster empire, Stellaris captures the imagination like nothing else. And at number 1, of course it's Europa Universalis IV. If you know me, you know this was always going to be my top pick, despite Luke's protests. EU4 is one of my most played games of all time, and for good reason. It's the crown jewel of Paradox Grand Strategy. Released in 2013, it took everything EU3 had been fumbling towards and nailed it. A polished launch, a beautiful map, streamlined mechanics, and monic power to shape nations, and it gave us a game that felt accessible and endlessly deep. Critics raved, fans lost weeks of their lives, and EU4 quickly became Paradox's defining hit. But it didn't stop there. Over 12 years, 17 major expansions, countless free updates have turned EU4 into an absolute behemoth. Estates, institutions, mission trees, professional armies, monuments, naval reworks, every patch is layered on more detail, more flavour, more replayability. Of course they weren't all hits, let's not talk about Leviathan, but the modding scene has only added to this madness. Extended timeline, Third Odyssey, entirely new histories were built on EU4's bones. And the multiplayer is still going strong, everything from sweaty competitive leagues to chaotic roleplay campaigns. Yes, the DLC model is pricey, but the sheer scope of EU4 is unmatched. For me, it's the perfect expression of Paradox's strengths. Deep, flexible, and infinitely replayable. Stellaris might have the imagination, CK2 the drama, Hearts of Iron 4 the mainstream pull, but EU4 is the emperor of all of them. After 12 years of hard work, it also might have just set a standard that is impossible for EU5 to live up to.